The winter of 1943 settled over Detroit like a heavy blanket, cold and unforgiving. The war felt both impossibly distant and suffocatingly close. Distant because the fighting raged thousands of miles away across two oceans, close because every family had sent someone, and every newspaper brought news that made mothers weep into their aprons. Frank Morrison never thought he'd be one of those names in the paper. At 32, he was too old for the first wave of conscription, and his work at the Packard Motor Car Company had earned him a deferment. Essential to the war effort, they called it. Frank called it luck, the kind that made him feel guilty every time he saw a gold star hanging in a neighbor's window. The factory floor roared with purpose that January morning. What once produced luxury automobiles now churned out Rolls-Royce Merlin engines for P-51 Mustangs. Frank wiped his perpetually grease-stained hands on his coveralls and squinted at the engine block before him. Even after 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, he couldn't shake the feeling that he should be doing more. "Morrison, you got a visitor." Frank looked up to see his foreman, Bill Hutchins, gesturing toward the office. Visitors during shift hours were unusual. His heart seized. Had something happened to his younger brother, Tommy, who was somewhere in the Pacific with the Marines? But the man waiting in the cramped office wasn't a chaplain or an officer. He wore a dark suit that looked expensive even in wartime, and his eyes held the kind of sharp intelligence that made Frank immediately wary. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Robert Hayes, War Department." He extended a hand. His grip was firm, calculated. "I need to speak with you about a matter of national security." Frank's throat went dry. "Is this about Tommy? My brother?" "No, sir. This is about you." Hayes gestured to a chair. "Please, sit." The office suddenly felt smaller. Through the window, Frank could see the assembly line continuing its relentless rhythm, men and women working side by side, building the machines that would carry American boys into battle. Hayes pulled out a folder, crisp and official. "Your personnel file makes interesting reading, Mr. Morrison. Top marks in mechanical aptitude. 2 years at Wayne University studying engineering before the Depression hit. You can tear down and rebuild a Merlin engine blindfolded, according to your supervisor. And you served 6 months in the Civilian Conservation Corps building bridges in Montana." "That was 10 years ago," Frank said carefully. "What's this about?" Hayes leaned forward, his voice dropping. "How would you feel about using those skills somewhere they're needed even more than here? I'm already building engines for fighter planes. How much more essential can you get? What if I told you we're losing the war, Mr. Morrison?" The words hit like a physical blow. Every newsreel, every radio broadcast, every government poster proclaimed American strength, inevitable victory. But Hayes's face showed no hint of propaganda. "That's not what the papers say," Frank managed. "The papers say what they need to say to keep morale up." Hayes opened the folder, revealing photographs that made Frank's stomach turn. Ships burning in the Atlantic. Rows of flag-draped coffins. Maps marked with red arrows pushing deeper into Allied territory. The U-boats are strangling our supply lines. Every day, German submarines send thousands of tons of supplies, food, weapons, medicine, fuel, to the bottom of the ocean. Our boys are fighting with half-empty rifles and empty bellies because the convoys can't get through. Frank stared at the photos, his mind reeling. "What does this have to do with me? I'm a mechanic, not a sailor." "We need mechanics, Mr. Morrison. Specifically, we need mechanics who can think on their feet, who can fix anything with whatever's at hand, who won't panic when things go wrong." Hayes pulled out another document. "There's a new ship, a prototype. It's designed to hunt U-boats, to turn the tables on the wolves that are bleeding us dry. But it's experimental, untested, and it needs a crew that can keep it running under conditions you can't imagine." "Why me?" "There are thousands of mechanics." "Because I've read your file." "Really read it." Hayes tapped the folder. 3 months ago, Engine 247 suffered a catastrophic failure during a test run. Should have taken 3 days to fix with the proper parts. You had it running in 14 hours using components from 2 other engines and a modified carburetor you built from scrap. The chief engineer called it mechanical sorcery.
Frank remembered that night.
The pressure, the impossible deadline, his hands moving almost of their own accord, seeing solutions where others saw only wreckage. "The North Atlantic isn't a factory floor," Frank said quietly.
"Men die out there. Men are dying everywhere, Mr. Morrison. The question is whether you're willing to help stop it."
Through the window, Frank watched a young woman, couldn't be more than 20, carefully assembling an engine component, her movements precise and practiced.
How many brothers, husbands, fathers were counting on her work? On his work?
"I have a mother who depends on me," Frank said.
"And Tommy. Your mother will receive your full wages, plus a stipend. And if this works, if we can break the U-boat stranglehold, your brother and every other serviceman will have the supplies they need to come home alive." Hayes stood, leaving the folder on the desk. "I'm not going to lie to you. This is dangerous. More dangerous than anything you've faced. But we wouldn't be having this conversation if we had anyone better. You have 48 hours to decide.
Report to this address." He slid a card across the desk, "if you're willing to serve your country in a way that might actually change the course of this war." Then he was gone, leaving Frank alone with photographs of burning ships and a decision that felt like it weighed more than any engine he'd ever lifted.
That evening, Frank sat at his mother's kitchen table, the radio playing big band music low in the background.
Margaret Morrison was 63, gray-haired and steel-spined, a woman who'd raised 2 boys alone after influenza took their father in 1919. "You're thinking too loud, Francis," she said, using the name only she called him. She set a plate of meatloaf, more breadcrumbs than meat, but she made it stretch in front of him.
"What happened today?"
Frank told her everything. His mother listened without interrupting, her weathered hands folded on the table, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Your father," she said softly, "believed that when you have the ability to help, you have the responsibility to try.
Even when it scares you."
"Especially when it scares you."
"I'm afraid," Frank admitted. "Not just of dying. I'm afraid of failing. Of making a mistake that costs other people their lives. That's how I know you'll do the right thing."
She squeezed his hand.
"Cowards don't feel fear like that. They only think about themselves. What about you? If something happens."
"Francis Morrison, I survived the Spanish flu, the Depression, and raising you and your brother. I'll survive whatever comes." Her eyes glistened, but her voice remained steady.
"Tommy needs you.
Not here, but out there, doing whatever it takes to bring him home. They all need you." Frank looked at his hands, calloused, scarred, perpetually stained with grease no amount of scrubbing could remove. Working man's hands. His father's hands.
Maybe that's exactly what the war needed.
2 days later, Frank stood at a nondescript warehouse on the Detroit waterfront, a single duffel bag over his shoulder. Hayes waited by a black sedan, flanked by 2 military policemen.
"Glad you made the right choice, Morrison." Hayes opened the car door.
"From here on out, everything you see, everything you do, is classified.
You tell no one where you're going or what you're doing. Understood?" Frank nodded, taking one last look at the Detroit skyline, the factory smokestacks belching their patriotic plumes.
Somewhere in that city, his mother was probably lighting a candle at St. Anne's, praying for both her sons. The car pulled away from everything Frank had ever known, carrying him toward a fate he couldn't imagine, toward a day that would test every skill he possessed and every ounce of courage he didn't know he had. He was just a mechanic. But the war was about to make him something more. The train rattled eastward through the night, its windows blacked out per wartime regulations. Frank sat in a private compartment with 5 other men, none of whom spoke beyond terse introductions. Hayes had made it clear, trust would come later, if at all. The man across from Frank was built like a boxer, with cauliflower ears and hands that looked like they could crush walnuts. "Vincent Caruso," he'd said with a thick Brooklyn accent.
"Engine room, Merchant Marine.
Survived 3 torpedo attacks."
He didn't elaborate, and Frank didn't ask.
Next to Vincent sat a thin, nervous-looking man in round spectacles who'd introduced himself as Dr. Arthur Penn, a physicist from MIT. He kept a leather journal clutched to his chest like a shield. The others were equally enigmatic: James Dutch Kellerman, a taciturn sonar operator from the Navy; Robert Chen, a navigation specialist whose quiet competence seemed to fill the space around him; and Eugene Gene Whitlock, a radio operator who chain-smoked Lucky Strikes and stared out the darkened window at nothing. They arrived at Boston Harbor just before dawn. The facility they were taken to didn't appear on any map. High fences topped with barbed wire surrounded a complex of warehouses and workshops that hummed with activity even at this early hour. Armed Marines guarded every entrance. Hayes met them at the gate, now wearing a Navy commander's uniform. "Gentlemen, welcome to Project Ironside. What you're about to see is classified at the highest level. The penalty for disclosure is a firing squad. Are we clear?" Everyone nodded. They were led through a maze of corridors to a briefing room where a scale model dominated a central table. Frank's breath caught. It was a ship, but unlike any he'd ever seen. Sleeker than a destroyer, bristling with unusual equipment, its hull painted in a strange mottled pattern. "Gentlemen, meet the USS Wraith," Hayes announced. She's smaller than a destroyer, faster than a corvette, and equipped with technology that's going to change naval warfare forever. "Dr. Penn?" The physicist stepped forward, his nervousness evaporating as he entered his element. The Wraith incorporates several experimental systems. First, a new type of sonar that can detect submarines at unprecedented ranges and depths. Second, a propulsion system that's remarkably quiet; we can hunt U-boats without them hearing us coming. Third, depth charges with proximity fuses that we believe will triple our kill ratio. "Believe?" Vincent interrupted. "You mean you don't know if this stuff works?" "We know it works in testing," Dr. Penn said defensively. "Combat conditions are different. That's where you come in," Hayes continued. "Each of you has been selected because you have skills the ship needs and the ability to adapt when things go wrong. And they will go wrong." He looked directly at Frank. "Morrison, you're our chief mechanic. Everything mechanical on this ship, propulsion, hydraulics, damage control, falls under your responsibility. The engines are unlike anything you've worked with. You'll have 48 hours to learn them before we sail." Frank's mouth went dry. 48 hours? The Atlantic doesn't wait for us to be ready, son. None of us get the luxury of being fully prepared. Hayes turned to the group. "Our mission is simple in concept, brutal in execution. Intelligence has pinpointed a Wolfpack 8 U-boats operating in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. They've sunk 47 Allied ships in the last 6 weeks. 47. Thousands of tons of supplies, hundreds of lives. We're going to hunt them down and send them to the bottom." The room fell silent. 8 submarines. 1 experimental ship with an untested crew. "Sir," Robert Chen spoke up, his voice measured, "standard protocol is to hunt U-boats with multiple escort vessels and air support." "Why are we going alone?" Hayes' expression hardened. "Because we can't spare the escorts. Every available ship is protecting the convoys we have left. The Wraith is our gamble; if she works, she changes everything. If she fails..." He let the implication hang in the air. "We die, and nobody ever knows we existed," Gene finished, lighting another cigarette. "Exactly." Hayes didn't sugarcoat it. "You volunteered for this, but if anyone wants out, now's the time. No shame in it. This mission has maybe a 40% chance of success." Frank looked around the room. Vincent's jaw was set, determined. Dutch stared at the model ship with the intensity of a man already planning his approach. Robert Chen's face betrayed nothing, but he didn't move toward the door. Dr. Penn looked terrified but remained seated. Gene just smoked. Nobody left. "Good." Hayes almost smiled. "You have 48 hours. Learn your stations, learn this ship, learn each other. We sail on the midnight tide, February 3rd, dismissed." The next 2 days blurred into a haze of technical manuals, emergency drills, and a crash course in systems that seemed to defy everything Frank knew about engineering. The Wraith's engines were revolutionary diesel-electric hybrids that could run almost silently on battery power. But they were temperamental, requiring constant adjustment and a mechanic's intuition to keep them balanced. Frank worked alongside a Navy engineer named Lieutenant Samuel Cross, a career man with 20 years of experience and an obvious skepticism about civilians. The problem with experimental technology, Cross explained as they examined the engine room, is that it breaks in ways you can't anticipate. By the book, these engines should purr like kittens. In reality? He tapped a gauge that flickered erratically. They have moods. You'll need to learn to read them, understand what they're telling you before disaster strikes. How long did it take you? Frank asked. Cross laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm still learning, Morrison. And we're about to get a very expensive education in the middle of the Atlantic with enemy submarines trying to kill us. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He lay in his narrow bunk in the crew quarters, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ship, the hum of generators, the creaking of metal, the muffled conversations of men who knew they might not live to see spring. Vincent's voice drifted from the bunk below. You awake, Morrison? Yeah. You scared? Frank considered lying. Terrified. A low chuckle. Good. Me too. Anybody who says they're not is either crazy or a liar. A pause. I was on the SS James McKay when a torpedo hit us. Middle of the night, no warning. The ship broke in half and went down in 4 minutes. 4 minutes. I watched men drown because there wasn't time to launch all the lifeboats. How'd you survive? Luck. Blind, stupid luck. I was on deck, smoking where I shouldn't have been. Got thrown clear when she broke up. Found a piece of wreckage to cling to. Floated for 11 hours before a British corvette picked me up. The bunk creaked as Vincent shifted. 38 men died that night. I remember every name. That's why I'm here, Morrison. Those bastards don't get to sink any more ships, drown any more sailors. Not if I can help it. Frank understood. It wasn't courage that brought them here. It was something deeper, a debt to the fallen, a responsibility to the living, a desperate need to make a difference in a war that was grinding up a generation. The kid in the photo on your footlocker, Vincent continued. Brother? Tommy. He's 19, Marine rifleman somewhere in the Pacific. Doesn't even know I left Detroit. He will. When we win this thing, when the supplies get through because we cleared the Atlantic, he'll know. They'll all know. Frank wanted to believe that. Had to believe it. The day before they sailed, Hayes gathered the crew in the Wraith's cramped mess hall. 42 men total, a skeleton crew for a ship this size, but secrecy demanded it. Frank recognized most of them now, the engine room crew, the sonar operators, the gunners, the damage control teams. All volunteers. All knowing the odds. Tomorrow night, we hunt, Hayes said simply. Some of you are career military. Some are civilians playing sailor. None of that matters anymore. On this ship, we're a crew. We trust each other, we watch each other's backs, and we do our jobs no matter what hell breaks loose around us. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. The Navy's official position is that this ship doesn't exist. There will be no medals, no recognition, no glory. If we succeed, it will be classified for decades. If we fail, our families will be told we died in training accidents. Cheerful, Gene muttered, but there was a grim smile on his face. I won't lie to you, we're attempting something that's never been done. One ship against a wolf pack. By every tactical manual, we should lose. But those manuals were written before this ship existed. Hayes placed his hand on the bulkhead, almost affectionate. The Wraith is our edge. Your skills are our strength. And the enemy's overconfidence is our opportunity. They think they own the Atlantic. We're going to prove them wrong. That night, Frank made one last trip above deck. Boston Harbor stretched before him, dark and quiet under wartime blackout conditions. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, German submarines prowled the shipping lanes like wolves among sheep. Dr. Penn joined him at the rail, his breath misting in the February cold.
Can't sleep either? Too much thinking, Frank admitted.
I keep running the calculations in my head, Penn said.
The sonar equations, the depth charge trajectories, the probability curves. Numbers are supposed to be comforting.
They're supposed to make sense of chaos.
Do they?
Penn pushed his glasses up his nose.
No.
All my equations tell me is that we're attempting something that has about a 4 in 10 chance of working.
Mathematics can't account for human courage, ingenuity, or luck. And I think we're going to need all three. Why'd you volunteer? Frank asked.
You could be safe in a university laboratory. My younger sister, Rachel, joined the Army Nurse Corps. She's in North Africa somewhere, patching up soldiers in a field hospital while German artillery pounds their position.
Penn's voice cracked slightly. She's braver than I'll ever be.
The least I can do is use my brain to maybe, possibly, help keep her and everyone like her alive.
Even if it means climbing into an experimental submarine hunter and sailing into a war zone. Frank nodded.
Everyone here had their reasons.
Everyone here had someone worth fighting for. February 3, 1943. 11:47 p.m. The USS Wraith slipped her moorings and glided silently into the dark Atlantic.
No fanfare, no ceremony, no one to wave goodbye.
Just a ship full of volunteers sailing toward the unknown.
Frank stood at his station in the engine room, his hands on controls that still felt unfamiliar, listening to the rhythmic thrum of engines that held all their lives in their mechanical hearts. Above him, on the bridge, Hayes would be plotting their course toward the hunting grounds. In the sonar compartment, Dutch would be listening for the distinctive signature of diesel engines and electric motors that marked their prey. Vincent appeared at Frank's elbow, wiping oil from his hands.
Engines sound good, boss. Almost too good.
Don't jinx it, Frank said, but he felt it too, that strange calm before the storm, the last moment of peace before everything changed. The ship rolled gently as they cleared the harbor, meeting the long Atlantic swells. Frank thought of his mother, probably asleep in her small house in Detroit, a prayer for both her sons on her lips.
He thought of Tommy, in some jungle foxhole half a world away, fighting a different war against a different enemy but facing the same fundamental question: would courage be enough?
Lieutenant Cross joined them, his experienced eyes scanning the gauges.
Morrison, we're about to run deep and silent. Battery power only.
The engines need to be perfect, any noise, any vibration, and we might as well send the U-boats an engraved invitation. They'll be perfect, Frank said with more confidence than he felt. Cross studied him for a moment, then nodded.
I believe you. Now let's go prove it.
The order came down from the bridge, rig for silent running.
All ahead slow.
Dive, dive, dive. The Wraith slipped beneath the waves like a ghost, her experimental hull designed to move through water with minimal disturbance, her crew holding their collective breath as they descended into the dark hunting grounds of the North Atlantic. Somewhere out there, 8 German submarines were stalking Allied convoys, their commanders confident in their superiority, unaware that the hunters had become the hunted. Frank's hands moved across the controls with growing confidence, feeling the rhythm of the ship, understanding now what Lieutenant Cross meant about the engines having moods. He could sense the subtle vibrations, the tiny fluctuations that others might miss, the whispers of metal and electricity that told him everything was running as it should.
Or wasn't. A gauge flickered. Frank's heart jumped. Cross, we've got a pressure variation in the cooling system. Starboard engine, circuit 3. Cross was beside him instantly. Damn. That's a faulty valve we noticed during trials.
It was supposed to be replaced. He cursed under his breath.
How bad? Frank watched the needle dance.
Not critical yet, but if it fails at the wrong moment, it'll sound like ringing a dinner bell for every U-boat within 50 miles. Cross made a decision.
Can you fix it while we're underway?
Frank thought of Engine 247, of impossible repairs under impossible conditions, of his hands knowing what his mind hadn't yet figured out.
Yes. But I'll need to shut down that circuit. We'll lose 20% power efficiency. Do it. Better slow than dead.
As Frank worked in the cramped, oil-smelling confines of the engine room, his tools moving with practiced precision, he realized something: this was why Hayes had chosen him. Not because he was the best mechanic in America, but because he was the kind of mechanic who could see solutions where others saw only problems, who could work miracles with whatever he had.
The valve came free.
Frank examined it in the dim light. The flaw was subtle, a microscopic crack that would have grown under pressure until catastrophic failure. He pulled a spare from the emergency kit, installed it with movements that had become almost meditative, tested the circuit. The gauge steadied. Pressure normalized.
"We're good," Frank called out.
Cross clapped him on the shoulder.
"First of many, Morrison. First of many."
Above them, in the sonar compartment, Dutch's voice crackled over the intercom. "Contact.
Bearing 270. Single screw, diesel signature. Range approximately 8,000 yards. Hayes's voice, calm and controlled, battle stations.
This is not a drill.
Prepare for engagement."
The ship came alive with purposeful movement. Every man moving to his station, every hand checking equipment, every heart beating faster.
They'd found the wolf. Now they had to kill it. Frank's hands returned to the controls, ready for whatever came next.
The engines hummed beneath his touch, steady, reliable, perfect. His father's hands had built things. His hands would help destroy the machines that were killing American sailors. The hunter was about to become the hunted. And Frank Morrison, mechanic from Detroit, was about to discover what kind of man he truly was. The contact Dutch had detected turned out to be a false alarm, a diesel freighter limping home from Newfoundland, struggling against the February swells. But the near engagement had served its purpose. It showed the crew what they were made of.
No panic. No hesitation. Just professionals doing their jobs.
For 3 days, the USS Wraith prowled the North Atlantic hunting grounds, moving through fog banks and rough seas like a predator searching for prey. The Wolfpack intelligence had pinpointed was out there somewhere, and Hayes was determined to find them. Frank learned to sleep in 4-hour intervals, always ready to be jolted awake by the general alarm. The engine room became his world, a cathedral of machinery that demanded constant attention, constant vigilance. Lieutenant Cross proved to be an invaluable mentor, teaching him the subtle rhythms of shipboard life, the unspoken protocols that kept 42 men functioning in such close quarters. Vincent worked the damage control teams with the intensity of a man who'd seen ships die and was determined it wouldn't happen again. Dr. Penn nervously monitored his sonar equipment, making constant adjustments to improve its range and accuracy.
Robert Chen plotted their course with meticulous precision, factoring in currents, weather, and the known patrol patterns of U-boat wolfpacks.
Gene kept the radio silent. Transmitting would give away their position, but listened constantly for enemy signals to triangulate. On the morning of February 7th, everything changed. Dutch's voice cracked over the intercom at 0547 hours, sharp with suppressed excitement. Multiple contacts. Bearing 315 through 020.
Count shows 5, possibly 6 distinct signatures. Diesel engines, submerged. Range 12,000 yards in closing. Frank felt his stomach drop. This was it. The Wolfpack.
Hayes's voice came through, steady as iron. All hands to battle stations.
Rig for silent running. Reduce speed to 5 knots.
Let's not let them know we're here until we're ready to introduce ourselves. The Wraith slowed to a crawl, her engines barely turning, every unnecessary system shut down to reduce noise. In the engine room, Frank and his team moved with practiced silence, their tools wrapped in cloth to prevent metallic clinks, their footsteps carefully placed. The minutes stretched into hours as Hayes maneuvered the Wraith into an attack position. Through the intercom, Frank could hear the terse, professional communications between stations.
Dutch calling out ranges and bearings. Robert Chen calculating intercept courses. The weapons officer, a grizzled chief named Kowalski, preparing the depth charges and the new proximity fuse charges Dr. Penn had designed.
"They're hunting," Dutch reported.
"Formation suggests they're searching for a convoy. Haven't detected us yet." Frank allowed himself to breathe.
The Wraith's experimental design was working. They were a ghost in the water, invisible to the very submarines they were hunting. Hayes's next words were barely above a whisper, but they carried the weight of impending violence. "We're going to take the trailing submarine first. Clean kill, fast and quiet. We can't let the others know we're here until we've thinned their numbers. Kowalski, prepare depth charges. Set for 200 feet. Dr. Penn, I need your fancy new toys to work exactly as promised." "They will, Commander." Penn's voice quavered slightly, but his conviction was clear. The Wraith crept forward, closing the distance with agonizing slowness. Frank's hands hovered over the engine controls, ready to give Hayes every ounce of power if they needed to run, or absolute silence if they needed to hide. "Range, 4,000 yards, Dutch intoned. Target is U-571, based on acoustic signature. She's running at periscope depth, probably preparing to surface for a battery charge."
Frank knew enough about submarine warfare now to understand the opportunity.
A submarine at periscope depth was vulnerable, focused on what was above the water, not what might be stalking it from behind.
"Range, 3,000 yards.
Target steady on course 090.
Speed 6 knots. Hayes let the distance close. 2,000 yards. 1,500. 1,000. Fire 1.
The depth charge rolled off the stern with a muffled splash.
Then another. And another.
Dr. Penn's experimental proximity charges followed, their sophisticated fuses designed to detonate at the optimal distance from a submarine's pressure hull.
Charges away. Time to target, 40 seconds. The longest 40 seconds of Frank's life.
He imagined the charges sinking through the dark water, tumbling toward their unsuspecting target. Imagine the German crew going about their duties, unaware that death was descending upon them. The first explosion was felt more than heard, a deep, resonating whump that shuddered through the Wraith's hull.
Then another. And another. 5 explosions in rapid succession, perfectly timed and positioned. Dutch's voice came through, almost awed, direct hit. Breaking up noises. She's going down. Hull collapse at depth. Target destroyed.
A cheer started in the weapons bay, but Hayes cut it off immediately, silent. "We've got 5 more out there, and they just heard that. Battle stations, prepare for counterattack. Morrison, I need full power on my command. Cross, get ready to push these engines harder than they've ever been pushed." "Understood, Commander," Frank replied, his hands already moving across the controls, bringing the dormant systems back to life, coaxing maximum efficiency from machinery that was about to be tested beyond its design limits. The other submarines reacted with terrifying speed. Suddenly, the hunters realized they were the hunted, and they scattered like startled wolves, diving deep, changing course, trying to locate their invisible attacker. "Multiple contacts, all bearings, all depths," Dutch called out, strain evident in his voice. "They're panicking, but they're searching. Sonar is picking up active pings, they're using their own sonar to find us." "Then let's give them something to find," Hayes said grimly. "All ahead full. Bring us around to bearing 270. Kowalski, prepare full spread. We're going after the next one before they can coordinate." The Wraith surged forward, her experimental engines roaring to life. Frank felt the ship respond like a living thing, powerful and agile, cutting through the water at speeds that should have been impossible for a vessel her size. But the U-boats weren't helpless prey. They were some of the most advanced submarines in the world, crewed by experienced hunters who'd sent dozens of Allied ships to the bottom. Torpedo in the water. Dutch screamed. Bearing 095, range 800 yards, closing fast. Hayes didn't hesitate. Hard right rudder. All ahead flank. Morrison, give me everything she's got. Frank slammed the throttles forward, bypassing safety protocols, pushing the engines into the red zone. The temperature gauges spiked. Warning lights flashed. But the engines responded with a surge of power that pressed him against his station. The Wraith heeled over in a sharp turn, her hull groaning with the stress. In the mess hall, unsecured items crashed to the deck. Men grabbed for handholds as the ship executed a maneuver that would have torn apart a less sturdy vessel. "Torpedo passing astern, 50 yards. Dutch reported. It missed. But there was no time for relief. Another submarine had acquired them, and another torpedo was in the water. Then another. 2 more fish. Dutch's voice climbed an octave. Multiple tracks, converging from port and starboard. They were in a kill box, torpedoes coming from 2 directions, escape routes narrowing by the second. Frank's mind raced through the options. They couldn't outrun both torpedoes, couldn't turn fast enough to evade them simultaneously. Lieutenant Cross appeared at his shoulder, his face pale but determined. "Morrison, we need a miracle." Frank stared at the engine controls, the temperature gauges screaming their warnings, the ship shuddering with strain. An idea formed, insane, desperate, probably suicidal. "I can give you 30 seconds of speed we're not supposed to have," Frank said. "But it'll burn out half the systems. We'll be limping home if it works." "If we don't do something, we won't be going home at all," Cross said. "Do it." Frank's hands moved with decisive certainty, rerouting power, bypassing limiters, feeding the engines with a surge of electrical current that made the entire system howl in protest. The temperature gauges went into zones marked with red warnings. Pressure readings climbed toward critical levels. But the Wraith leaped forward like a racehorse given the whip, accelerating beyond her design specifications, beyond what should have been possible. "Hang on!" Hayes bellowed from the bridge. The ship executed a maneuver that would be studied in naval academies for decades after the war, a sudden, violent turn at maximum speed, a controlled skid across the surface of the ocean that positioned them perpendicular to both torpedo tracks. The first torpedo passed 10 yards ahead of the bow. The second passed 15 yards astern. For a heartbeat, the entire crew held their breath. Then Dutch's jubilant voice, "Both torpedoes missed. Clear water." But the celebration was premature. One of the submarines had surfaced, its deck gun manned, shells already screaming toward the Wraith. The first shell hit the forward superstructure, tearing through metal like paper. The explosion threw Frank against his console. Alarms shrieked. Emergency lights flickered. "Damage report," Hayes demanded. Voices called out from all stations, "Forward compartment breached. Taking on water. Fire in the galley. Casualties in the weapons bay." Frank tasted blood. His vision swam. But his hands never left the controls. The engines were still running, damaged, protesting, but running. Vincent's voice came through, urgent, "Morrison, we've got flooding in the forward bilge. Pumps can't keep up. If we don't seal that breach, we'll lose buoyancy. Damage control teams, forward compartment." Hayes ordered. "Kowalski, return fire with everything we have. Kill that submarine before it kills us." The Wraith's guns opened up, tracers arcing across the gray water toward the surfaced U-boat. The submarine's deck gun fired again, but the shot went wide as the U-boat captain tried to dive, realizing he'd made himself vulnerable. Too late. Dr. Penn's experimental charges, launched from the forward tubes, struck the submarine at optimal depth. The explosions were catastrophic, the U-boat's pressure hull split like an eggshell, and she went down in seconds, taking her entire crew with her. 2 down. 4 to go. But the Wraith was bleeding. Frank could feel it in the sluggish response of the controls, hear it in the grinding protest of damaged machinery. They'd taken a serious hit, and the other submarines knew it. "They're closing in," Dutch reported, his voice tight. "All 4 contacts converging on our position. They smell blood." Hayes's voice remained calm, but Frank could hear the steel underneath. "We're not done yet. Morrison, can you give me maneuvering power?" Frank assessed the damage, his mind calculating faster than he'd thought possible. The starboard engine was failing, coolant leaking, temperature climbing toward catastrophic. The port engine was holding, but barely. Electrical systems were compromised.
Hydraulics were shot. But they were still alive. Still fighting.
I can give you 15 knots for maybe 20 minutes, Frank said.
After that, we're dead in the water. Then we make these 20 minutes count. Kowalski, plot firing solutions on all remaining targets. We're taking them all at once. Sir? Kowalski's voice carried disbelief. Standard doctrine is. Standard doctrine doesn't apply to ships that don't exist, Chief. We go after all of them, or we die trying. Those are the only options.
What followed would be dissected in classified military briefings for years: a single damaged experimental ship taking on 4 U-boats simultaneously, executing a series of attacks that defied every tactical manual, driven by a commander who refused to accept defeat and a crew that had become something more than the sum of its parts. The Wraith danced through the chaos, her damaged engines singing a song of defiance. Frank nursed every ounce of power from machinery that should have failed, his grease-stained hands coaxing miracles from metal and electricity. Vincent and his damage control team sealed breaches, fought fires, kept the ship afloat through sheer determination and welding torches. Dr. Penn's experimental weapons proved their worth, each charge finding its target with uncanny accuracy. Dutch's sonar calls became a rhythm, a heartbeat that guided their attacks. Robert Chen's navigation threaded them through impossible positions, turning disadvantages into opportunities. Gene's radio silence was finally broken as he transmitted a single message: coordinates of the Wolfpack's position, sent to every Allied ship and aircraft within range. Reinforcements were coming, but they were hours away. The third submarine died to a combination of depth charges and the Wraith's forward guns. The fourth tried to run deep but was caught at 400 feet by proximity fuse charges that crushed its hull like a tin can. The fifth submarine was the most cunning. Her commander, likely the Wolfpack leader, tried to position himself for a killing shot, stalking the damaged Wraith like a shark circling wounded prey. Contact bearing 010, range 600 yards and closing, Dutch called out. He's got us lined up, Commander. Perfect firing position. Hayes made a decision that was either brilliant or insane: all stop. Cut engines. Play dead. Sir? Lieutenant Cross looked at Hayes as if he'd lost his mind. Do it. Morrison, shut it all down. Make them think we're finished. Frank understood immediately. It was a desperate gamble. If the submarine commander believed they were disabled, he might surface to finish them with the deck gun, conserving his remaining torpedoes. And a surfaced submarine was vulnerable. The engines died. The Wraith wallowed in the swells, listing slightly from the flooding forward, smoke rising from the damaged superstructure. From the outside, she looked like a dying ship. The minutes crawled past. In the engine room, Frank stood motionless, his hand on the ignition, ready to restart the engines on a second's notice. Sweat dripped down his face despite the February cold. This was either going to work, or they were about to die. He's surfacing, Dutch whispered, as if the enemy might hear him. Range 400 yards. He's breaking the surface. Through the intercom came Kowalski's voice, barely controlled excitement. I've got him in my sights, sir. Permission to fire? Hold, Hayes commanded. Let him get closer. Let him get confident. The U-boat surfaced fully, her crew scrambling to man the deck gun. The submarine captain probably saw what he expected: a crippled enemy ship, helpless, ready to be finished off. He was wrong. Now! Hayes roared. Morrison, full power. Kowalski, fire everything. Frank's hands flew across the controls. The engine screamed back to life, stuttering, catching, roaring with defiance. The Wraith surged forward, closing the distance. Every weapon the ship had opened fire simultaneously. Guns, depth charges, the last of Penn's experimental charges, even small arms from the crew on deck. A wall of fire and steel descended on the U-boat. The submarine's deck gun got off one shot wild, panicked, missing by 100 yards. Then the Wraith's barrage found its mark. The U-boat exploded. Not a sinking, but a catastrophic detonation that suggested they'd hit the torpedo room. A pillar of fire and water rose into the gray sky, and when it settled, there was nothing left but debris and oil spreading across the surface. 5 down.
One to go. But the Wraith was finished. The final surge of power had pushed the engines past their breaking point.
In the engine room, the starboard engine seized with a grinding shriek of tortured metal.
The port engine ran for another 30 seconds before its cooling system failed completely and it shut down with a dying shudder.
"We're dead in the water," Frank reported, his voice hoarse. "I can maybe get us auxiliary power for lights and pumps, but we're not going anywhere under our own power."
The last submarine, the sixth member of the Wolf Pack, was still out there. Dutch tracked it on passive sonar, listening to it circle at a safe distance, assessing, planning.
"He knows we're crippled," Hayes said quietly. "He's going to wait us out, pick his shot, finish us off when we can't maneuver." The crew waited in tense silence. They'd won an impossible victory, 5 U-boats destroyed in a single engagement, something that had never been done before and might never be done again.
But if the sixth submarine killed them, no one would ever know. Frank thought of his mother. Of Tommy.
Of all the sailors on all the ships that might now make it across the Atlantic because of what they'd done here today. Then Jean's voice crackled over the intercom, barely suppressing excitement. "Commander, I'm picking up transmissions.
Aircraft, high frequency. Our earlier signal, reinforcements are coming.
Navy Liberators, 20 minutes out. Tell them to hurry," Hayes said.
"We're sitting ducks."
The last submarine commander must have heard the same transmissions. He had 20 minutes to sink the Wraith, or Allied aircraft would force him to dive and run.
20 minutes to avenge his Wolf Pack. Torpedo in the water. Dutch screamed. "Bearing 270, range 1,000 yards. We can't dodge this one, Commander. We don't have engines." Time seemed to slow.
Frank looked around the engine room at the men who'd become his brothers in just a few short days.
Vincent, his face set in grim determination. Lieutenant Cross, standing tall despite knowing what was coming. The rest of the crew, young men and old, volunteers all, who'd given everything for a mission no one would ever know about. Hayes's voice came through one final time. "It's been an honor, gentlemen. You changed the war today. Remember that." Frank closed his eyes, thinking of his father's hands, wondering if he'd done enough, if his life had mattered. The torpedo closed. 500 yards. 300. 100.
And then, impossibly, the ocean erupted. Not with the explosion of the Wraith dying, but with the massive detonation of a submarine under attack. The last U-boat had surfaced to improve its firing solution and surfaced directly beneath a Navy Liberator bomber that had arrived earlier than expected, diving through the clouds like an avenging angel. The submarine died before it could dive, broken apart by depth charges from the aircraft, its final torpedo losing guidance and spinning harmlessly away. 6 for 6. The Wolf Pack was destroyed. The crew of the USS Wraith erupted in cheers, men hugging each other, crying, laughing with the hysteria of those who'd looked death in the face and somehow survived. Frank slumped against his console, exhausted beyond anything he'd ever experienced. His hands were shaking. His shirt was soaked with sweat and oil and blood from a dozen small cuts he hadn't noticed receiving. Vincent appeared, pulling him into a crushing bear hug. "We did it, Morrison. We actually did it." Lieutenant Cross was there too, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Those engines, Morrison. You coaxed miracles from them. Your father would be proud." Hayes's voice came through the intercom one more time. "Morrison, report to the bridge. There's something you need to see." Frank climbed the ladder to the bridge, his legs barely supporting him. Hayes stood at the window, looking out over the water where debris from 6 submarines floated alongside the smoke and damage from their own ship. "Look," Hayes said quietly, pointing to the horizon. Frank looked. In the distance, a convoy was visible, 15, maybe 20 cargo ships, escorted by a handful of destroyers. They'd been the Wolf Pack's intended target. Because of the Wraith's mission, because of today's impossible battle, those ships would make it to England. The supplies they carried would reach the troops who needed them. "How many lives do you think are on those ships?" Hayes asked. "How many soldiers will eat tonight because of the food those vessels are carrying? How many tanks will reach the front lines?
How many planes will fly? Frank couldn't speak around the lump in his throat. The official record will say nothing about this, Hayes continued. The Wraith doesn't exist. This battle never happened. But those sailors over there, they get to live. Their families won't get the telegram. And somewhere, in North Africa or Italy or the Pacific, soldiers will have the supplies they need because you kept an engine running when it should have died. You made the impossible possible, Morrison. Frank thought about all the definitions of hero he'd ever heard. Men storming beaches. Pilots dogfighting in the sky. Soldiers charging machine gun nests. He'd never imagined that a hero could be a mechanic from Detroit with grease-stained hands, keeping an engine running in the dark. But as he looked at the convoy sailing safely toward England, at the crew of the Wraith alive despite impossible odds, at the ocean now emptied of the wolves that had terrorized it, he understood. Heroes weren't always the ones who pulled the trigger or led the charge. Sometimes heroes were the ones who kept the machinery running, who solved the impossible problems, who did their jobs with everything they had when the world depended on it. He was just a mechanic. But on February 7, 1943, in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, that had been exactly what the world needed. The USS Wraith limped into Boston Harbor 3 days later, towed by a Navy destroyer, her hull scarred and her engine silent. The crew was transferred to a secured facility and debriefed under armed guard. Every man signed documents swearing them to secrecy under penalty of treason. The Wraith was quietly decommissioned, her experimental technology incorporated into the next generation of submarine hunters, her existence erased from the official record. Frank Morrison returned to Detroit in March 1943, officially listed as having completed special training for war production efficiency. He went back to the Packard plant, back to building engines for P-51 Mustangs, his hands as grease-stained as ever. But he never spoke of the Wraith. Never told his mother or Tommy about what he'd done. The only evidence of his service was a small box he kept locked in his desk, a box containing a letter from Commander Hayes, handwritten. Morrison, you were right. Sometimes a mechanic is exactly what changes history. The Atlantic is safer because you knew how to make an engine sing. That convoy made it through. They all made it through. Remember that when you wonder if it mattered. Hayes. Tommy came home from the Pacific in 1945, wounded but alive. He'd fought on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, seen horrors that Frank could only imagine. But he came home because the supplies had gotten through, because the Navy had won the Battle of the Atlantic, because someone had cleared the wolves from the shipping lanes. Frank never told him he'd been part of that victory. In 1947, Frank married a woman named Helen who worked as a nurse at Detroit General Hospital. They had 3 children. He opened his own garage in 1952, Morrison's Auto Repair, where he built a reputation as the mechanic who could fix anything. On February 7 every year, he would take the day off, drive to Lake Michigan, and stand on the shore, looking out over the water. Helen never asked why, sensing it was something private, something sacred. Vincent Caruso became a union organizer in Brooklyn, fighting for the rights of merchant marines. Dr. Arthur Penn returned to MIT and went on to develop sonar systems that would be used for decades. Robert Chen joined the State Department, his navigation skills finding new purpose in diplomacy. Eugene Whitlock opened a radio repair shop in Boston. Lieutenant Samuel Cross stayed in the Navy, eventually retiring as a captain with 30 years of service. None of them ever spoke publicly about the Wraith. But every February 7th, each man would receive a simple postcard with no return address, just 5 words, "We remember. We survived." Hayes. Commander Robert Hayes remained in naval intelligence until his retirement in 1963. In his personal papers, sealed until 50 years after his death, was a detailed account of the USS Wraith and her impossible victory. When those papers were finally opened in 2015, the world learned about a ship that didn't exist and a crew that had changed the course of the war without anyone knowing. Frank Morrison died in 1992 at the age of 81, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. At his funeral, a very old man in a Navy uniform appeared, Vincent Caruso, now in his 90s, who'd traveled from Brooklyn to say goodbye to the mechanic who'd kept them alive. He was just a mechanic, Vincent said in his eulogy.
But on one day, when the world needed it most, he was so much more. He was the man who made the impossible possible. He was a hero, even if he never believed it himself. Frank Morrison's hands, calloused, scarred, forever marked by a lifetime of honest work, had indeed changed history. Not with a gun or a sword, but with wrenches and wire, with intuition and determination, with the simple refusal to let an engine die when lives depended on it. He was just a mechanic. Until the day he became a hero. And that made all the difference.